Are we live? I guess so. Welcome, and thanks for coming. Get here so I can see. This is a spontaneously written little brief here, so hang on with me. So Zero Waste Vashon started about 2.5 years ago on a quest to reduce Vashon's waste stream. It's our #1 export, garbage. We started by studying the problem and solutions for waste reduction, and then by developing a partnership with King County for waste reduction. Zero Waste Vashon and King County Solid Waste Division worked together to improve recycling and then start measuring the volume of yard waste on island. While some materials like glass and metal need to go off island for processing, other materials like yard waste are not really waste at all. It turns out that waste products like food and yard waste are actually great resources. With a little processing, they can become wonderful soil amendments. Zero Waste Vashon is learning about processing food and yard waste and educating ourselves and the community on the options. For leafy yard waste, composting is a good solution, but there are other options as well, especially for larger woody waste. One option is a remarkably ancient and yet still very effective process. This is called biochar. Biochar has been used in ancient times and ancient civilizations from the Amazon to Africa and is still used in many cultures today. Zero Waste Vashon started testing biochar last summer and the results were quite positive. So we had extended them now to a larger test garden plot in partnership with Vashon Maori Community Food Bank in the test garden behind the IGA. And we're already seeing some interesting results. Zero Waste Vashon is working on educating ourselves and the community on our options to turn waste into resources that stay on island. This process will reduce trucking and ferry trips, which will in turn reduce carbon emissions, while providing the community with premium quality soil amendments. As part of educating ourselves, we have found that we are very fortunate to have some knowledgeable experts here in the Northwest. Last year, Ken Miller introduced me to Norm Baker, who has not only studied biochar intensively, he walks the walk and puts it into his own gardens and produce. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to Ken Miller, Island Char Czar, who will now introduce Norm.
Well, welcome. I don't know about the Char Czar part. I had the pleasure of meeting Norm 2 years ago at our first biochar class in Sebastopol, California. We had a gathering of about 50 folks from all around the world, in fact, that attended that gathering. I had to go there to meet him when he lives right up in Sequim, not too far away from here. Anyway, he comes with impressive academic credentials. But really, he's just a kid that likes to play with fire like the rest of us. He has a BS in zoology and ecology, an MS in ecology and entomology, and a doctorate in protein chemistry and polarized light microscopy. I got it right. I hate those 50-cent words. In addition, he's been a lifelong environmentalist with activities in marine fisheries restoration, wolf recovery, energy efficiency for buildings, organic gardening, and for many years he and his wife Nancy ran the North Star Nurseries up in, Peggy, what did I say? Anyway, I'm sorry.
That's my other wife.
Okay. In Rogers, Minnesota. And twice his environmental work has appeared in national magazines. Currently, he's a member of the executive committee of the North Olympic Group of the Sierra Club, where biochar and marine fisheries restorations are his specific environmental issues. 3 years ago, he attended Apavricho Stove Camp in Cottage Grove, Oregon, where he won the Curtis P. Smith Cat P Award, and I'll let him explain that. So I'll introduce you to Norm Baker. Thank you.
Boy, with an introduction like that, I feel like I've got to deliver, you know? Geez, guys. Goodness gracious, what a gorgeous facility. Thank you, Kay White. Thank you, Zero Waste and Viga and the people of Vashon. I feel honored to be able to talk in a room like this. Let me start with a personal comment. Right now, there are so many big environmental and cultural problems facing our economy, and unfortunately, our governmental response is kind of on the small side. In fact, it's often kind of silly, to be honest about it. But one of the things that really gives me hope for the future of mankind and the American way of doing things is when groups come together like this, grassroots activists who just want to know a better way and work together to do something in a better way. And thank you very much. I sure appreciate that. This talk has been revised every time I get a new publication. It should say June 2015. It's been revised 3 times since March. So I'm a little rough around the edges, but we will try to make it work. Let's see. Biochar is the answer. It's a miracle. Guys, biochar is almost too good to be true. You read some of the literature, and it's touted to be the miracle of the ages. Be careful of what you read on the internet. Be careful what you read in the magazines and the newspapers. Stick to the science, and that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk just about the science. I'm a science nerd. I love to get in there and get all complicated with all this stuff, you know. And stick to the science, and you'll be in real good shape. This is kind of the outline we're gonna follow today. And the first point I want to make, as an environmentalist, you know how there's always a group for it and then a group against it. And you've got to work and work and work over years to come together to some sort of compromise, like wolf restoration. There are people who think that's vermin of the earth, remove them, and there are other people who say we need them for the ecosystem. Biochar is different. It's a win-win-win all the way around, which really surprises me. I have never had so much stinking fun being an environmentalist as when I started with biochar. People often ask, when was your first experience with biochar? Peggy and I belong to the Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association, and we had our annual meeting, and there was a prof coming in talking about soil fertility. And he's talking about compost and soil texture and all this stuff, you know, which all of us now take for granted. And some young guy in the back of the room says, what's the most fertile soil on the earth? And this old prof says, Middle America prairies, incredibly rich, and this weird stuff out of South America called Terrapreta. But we don't know anything about it. That stuck in the back of my mind. If this soil is so fertile, for God's sakes, we need to know more about it. There's just no question. Where does Terrapreta come from? It's a Spanish word that simply means dark soils. It's thought to be a combination of every organic refuse the Indians wanted to get rid of. There's lots of broken pottery in these Terrapreta soils. We are speculating they figured out that charcoal would reduce the smell of night soil, what they had to do in their hut in the middle of the night without going outside. Maybe they were cooking over the charcoal and they found out that it mitigated smell, so that it gradually evolved into Terrapreta soils. It is extremely nutritious right from the ground. Right now, you can go to Brazil and go into a big box store, and there are entrepreneurs who are digging this stuff out of the ground, pulling out the roots and the rocks and the weeds, bagging it and selling it as potting soil. That's how nutritious it is. It hasn't been tended by anyone for a couple of hundred years. It's carbon dated to 5,000 years old. There's even one site where they think it's 9,000 years old. Modern people think it might have covered a population that covered 10% of the Amazon basin and fed somewhere around 1 million people, which is now reduced down to just a few thousand. These people used only native plants for their crops, and it was the only truly sustainable agricultural system in the world. That is surprising. This is a picture on site. See if I can operate this. This is the biochar soil. It's about a full yard deep. This is right next door, unamended soil. Does the unamended soil look like yours and mine? It sure does at my place. Oops. The question is, how did we lose this information? How did we lose the only truly sustainable agricultural system in the world? Turns out Spanish conquistadors brought 3 diseases like measles and mumps to a susceptible population, and they started dying off extremely quickly. They went from groups of 150 people down to just a few, maybe 20 individuals, and if somebody got sick, everybody else moved away. They didn't want to catch it. They had no possibility of dealing with that. They resorted to a slash and burn agricultural system, which is only productive for about 3 years. They cut down the trees, they burn it carefully over a big area, they garden that for 3 or 4 years, and then they have to move. What did modern man come in with? Pesticides, chainsaws, and fertilizers, and we made it worse for them. Now we're trying to back up and recapture some of what they were doing. If you really get into biochar, there's this book, which is pretty good. It's a little dated now. Whoops. This one is the one you want to pick up and read. It is currently about to undergo revision and updating. There is so much new information about biochar, it's staggering. I have to update this talk every time I give it. Just so you know, yours truly has been asked to contribute a chapter to a book this man is editing and writing on Biochar Manual for Farmers. I was so pleased, it gave me goosebumps to be asked to write that. And you'll see some of the data that I'm going to write about. This one is pretty good, especially if you're a climatologist interested in global warming. If you really want to read something that will put you to sleep at night, read this one. It came out in 2009 and was republished in 2015, all 450 pages, for almost 500 pages. It's the academic version. I get off on this stuff, so I've got to read it. Another one's Biochar and Soil Biota. Will Lockwood and I were talking. The soil biota is so poorly known, and we are figuring out it's that healthy soil that really makes crops nutritious. The other one is academic dark earth. That's very academic if you're a lab rat like me. Now let's define it. Charcoal can be made from almost any kind of carbon-based material. We could take this stand right here and make charcoal out of it. But what you wouldn't want is the contaminants, the environmental pollutants and contaminants that are in that. For instance, there's a plant right here in the state of Washington that takes used tires and they make tons of charcoal. But you wouldn't want the heavy metals in your garden. You wouldn't want some of the organic compounds that are in it. Pyrolysis is how you make biochar. Biochar is only made from previously living biomass or waste, and I mean anything previously living. My cat killed a bird once, so I made bird biochar. There is a crematorium in Illinois where you can be cremated to ash, or you can be pyrolyzed to biochar so that your final act is to be carbon negative. How's that for a hoot? I'm gonna vote for that. International Biochar Initiative, you can go on the web and check what they're doing. They're trying to be a clearinghouse for all of the information that's coming out on biochar. And it's amazing how much it is coming out. This guidelines for biochar use in soils, it's being revised as we speak. It's difficult to stay on top of it. And literally every different wood source or every different carbon source that will make a reputable biochar makes a slightly different biochar. And more uses are being discovered all the time. And we'll talk about that at the end of the talk. Of course, there's the left and the right, the polarized version. This biochar biofuel watch was one of the most quoted articles. When I started talking about biochar at Sierra Club, I would bet half of my executive committee sent me that citation and said, Norm, you've got to read this. And then we discovered this Dr. May Wan Ho, who also says this just does not work. And honest to gosh, guys, this quote and this quote is slowly becoming true. This has been out there 6 years and 3 years, and these guys are carrying the day. That's a generous statement. That's almost an overstatement, but boy, it's becoming true. And I want you to notice, the half-life of biochar is 1,100 years. If I've got a 100-pound bag of it, and we take it outside and bury it in the lawn, in 1,100 years, there's going to be 550 pounds of it. Another 1,100 years will be half of that. Another 1,100, half of that. This is a long-term soil amendment. Yes. Now let's back up a little bit. In the world of open burning, we all know there's several different forms of making fire. We can have pit or batch charcoal kilns, just a big hole covered with leaves, covered with soil. They set it on fire, it smokes and stinks for weeks. Very high pollutants. We can have a campfire. Everybody's done a campfire. It also has some pollution problems. We can also have rocket stoves, which are getting better and better. At the recent Ethos Cook Stove meeting in Seattle, Jonathan Posner introduced a rocket stove whose emissions were cleaner than the World Health Organization advises by a factor of 4. That was incredible. And the Updraft people, where Francesco and I have been, the man was blown away, was just blown away. And while I'm thinking about it, Francesco, could you stand up and wave or something? Francesco knows a lot about biochar, so does Ken. I want you people to feel free to ask them any question. In fact, I forgot to say this up front. Let's run this like a workshop. If somebody wants to say something or ask a question, feel free to do so. I suspect I will answer most of the questions as we go through, but if you've got a burning question, just go ahead and ask, because no one person can know it all, and we all benefit if we start sharing more and more knowledge. We also have T-LUDs. That means top-lit updraft. These are gasifier stoves. They use woody biomass to make biochar and to do some cooking on, and we are going to demonstrate some T-LUDs. Ken brought his 1 gallon and his 7 gallon, and I brought the 55 gallon. We are really excited about what we're finding here. You can also do a retort where there's no oxygen getting into it. And you can also have a charcoal fire. Think of Weber grill. This is a pit charcoal maker, the most common form of making charcoal in the world. The wood is stacked in there semi-dry. They cover it over with leaves, cover it with soil, set it on fire, and it does that for weeks on end. I think we missed one. This is an old-style steel charcoal kiln. It wasn't really used to make charcoal. It was used to get rid of logging waste. They would run some sort of a conveyor belt up here and just fill it full of stuff, set it on fire and smoke and stink and create all kinds of pollution for hours and days and weeks on end. This is a rocket stove. What makes a rocket stove unique? The air intake is equal to the exhaust, and you get a very clean burn. These are on the market now. I would not recommend them, even though they are a better step forward. This is a rocket stove in progress. Francesco and I went down to Alpervecho, and this was my little experiment. And Ken was telling you about the Curtis P. Smith Cat Plea Award. I didn't put that on my resume. There was a contest in England to design a better wood stove for heating a home. And the first criterion they used was to take a rag soaked in cat pee and throw it on the stove and see if it stank and how long it took to dry. So that's where the Curtis P. Smith Cat Pee Award comes from. You got to start someplace, you know. This is a T-Lud, Toplit updraft gasifier stove. Francesco and I and Ken and I have built these. This is really cool. That's a 5-gallon paint bucket. That's a number 10 food can, and you can tell there's just a little bit of accessory hardware. What makes a Toplit updraft unit work, the primary air intake is at the bottom. It is generally 20% of the secondary air intake, which is up here. When you regulate the oxygen input through the wood chips and into the second air, you get nearly complete combustion of the smoke. If you start with dry firewood, and you're going to see that at the burn over at the Seattle distillery after, we've got 3 T-Luds, we're going to run them all, and you can see it firsthand. There is enormous potential for this simple technology. This is my backyard. This is version 4, 5, and 6. This afternoon, you guys are the first people to see version 12 in action. I want to hear every question and comment. Ken wants to hear them too, so we can figure out how to make this thing better. Again, primary air is 15% of the total that goes through the whole thing. And you'll notice little differences here. They're incremental differences. Being a backyard tinkerer and citizen scientist, I had to do comparisons. Francesco has helped me do this, and in fact, several people have. George will, several people at the Grange. We have done some workshops. That secondary air enters and you get near combustion. The new version, no taller than that, and the flame would be right about here. Much safer to use. There's also a retort, and I love this. That is an Army ammo can. Use a screwdriver, pry out the rubber gasket, throw it away, fill it full of any kind of wood you've got. If you've got a woodworking shop or yard waste or you want to do pellets, you are wonderful. Thank you.
But not pressure treated waste.
I'm sorry?
Not pressure treated waste.
Not pressure treated, absolutely. You do not want the metals in there. Any kind of wood you can put in there. You close it up. Oh, good grief. One of these days, technology and I are going to learn to get along. If you heat with a wood stove, you know how the wood burns down and you get that nice layer of coals in the bottom? Slip that ammo can, close it, slip it in there, and this is what you'll see happen. The wood stove is open, and the gases that are coming off the wood that combust are those yellow flames. You are heating your home, and you're making a high-quality biochar in one step. Now, you would think, when you learn how much biochar would really work in your soils, you think, well, that's not very much biochar. Well, I gave a talk to Squim Organic Gardeners, and there was a little lady, very quiet. She was interested, but, she's not terribly communicative. And she said she wanted to try this, and I said, well, if you got any questions, let me know. Never heard a word from her until this past spring. Well, that's me. I'm sorry. Never heard a word from her until this past spring, and I said, Bev, how's your biochar making going? And she said, I've got 55 gallons just from operating the wood stove over winter. I said, you're kidding. She says, no, we're really on our way. I did some quick calculations. 55 gallons of biochar is enough to amend 80 square feet of garden on an ongoing basis. She is making quality biochar and doing the sustainable thing for her garden. Boy, this thing is touchy. This is what it looks like when you open it. You just let it cool in the wood stove, take it out the next morning, build the next fire, stick another ammo can in. This is also a retort used for metal smithing. This one is rather interesting. You open the barrel over here, you stuff it full of every piece of wood you can get in there. And I mean you cram it in. Firewood, lawn waste, yard waste, shrub trimmings, everything. Then you build a big wood fire down here. As it heats up and the gases come off the wood, they come through this pipe down here, and there's a row of 1/4-inch holes right here. And they start feeding the flame like the retort did in the wood stove. And boy, this gets hot. There's one video on YouTube where a fellow built one of these out in his yard, and it got so hot it melted his TV cable underground. I bet that was interesting. I bet he had trouble explaining that to the technician to fix it. Come on. This is biochar made from straw. We attended a workshop from Art Donnelly over in C-Char in Seattle, and we made straw biochar. Stuff is excellent. You have to quench the biochar. You can quench it with a nutrient solution, or you can quench it with straight water. At the moment, I'm using straight water. There are people who are investigating what to quench it with that already infuses it with plant nutrients, and that research is going to be very interesting coming up. And just so you know, Paul Taylor, the editor and author of the Biochar Revolution, is coming to Port Townsend. He's going to spend a little bit of time working with me and a little bit of time hiking in the Olympics, and we are going to talk him into giving us this information, what to quench the biochar with to functionalize it for soil incorporation. There is also a conservation burn, and I really don't prefer these. You see exactly what it is, medium-sized logs, then bigger logs, always stacked in this fashion. You get up to smaller logs, you get a nice big pile about this high. You light it on top, always from the top. If you burn that from the bottom, you'll get ash. You're wasting all that resource. Start it at the top. Holy cow. I need my wife to do this for me. You know, she's so good at keeping me normal. Here we go. Eventually it burns down, and when it reaches that point where it starts to produce ash, you hose it down with a garden hose. No, I'm kidding, Peg. I'm just kidding. You hose it down with a garden hose, you let it cool a little bit, and you rake out the big chunks. Rake out the big chunks, and you've got biochar. And it's a good idea to crush it up a little bit. You don't want big chunks going into your soil. You want something that's finer and smaller. But these people produce 13 bags of biochar, or a cubic meter, from a pickup load of wood that was 3 meters square. A full pickup load produced a cubic yard of biochar. That pile of biochar over there on today's market is going to be at least $250. And some people are charging well into $600 for that bag of biochar. You and I can do this ourselves. This is where the rubber meets the road. Notice here, a 3-stone fire or a conservation burn. These are the levels of carbon monoxide in red, and the particulate matter is in blue. And obviously, it's well above the EPA recommended levels. Improved cook stoves are a little better. The rocket stove is significantly better, but look at this tea lead that saves biochar. That is so much better, it's incredible. Much, much less carbon monoxide coming off, much, much less particulate matter. And look at the charcoal stove, your Weber grill. Granted, the particulate matter is low, and the truth is I had to put that figure there to make it fit on the slide because it actually belongs up here. Every year we hear somebody trying to warm themselves with a charcoal fire in a closed house over winter when the power goes out, and they get serious problems from it. Notice also the retort has about that same level of emissions, very, very low. One of the things I really believe in is the democratization of biochar. There are some corporate entities that are coming online trying to make biochar. Good for them. We need, however, to have it at all levels of society. And right now, about 90% is made by do-it-yourselfers. Guys like Ken and Will making it in their backyard. Some of the permaculture farms are starting to use it. I think they've only been using it just a couple of years. Entrepreneurs are popping up everywhere. They're starting to surface. Corporate is just now getting into it. Right now in the Pacific Northwest, there's only 25, I think it's 25 or 29, maybe Francesco knows this better, businesses that are entrepreneurial trying to do biochar. But as far as I know, only a couple are actually functional. For counties, states, and national, nobody is doing it. Nobody is doing it. International Biochar Initiative is trying to do it, and the United States Biochar Initiative is trying to inform the political machinery, but so far it just hasn't happened. We do need some sort of legislation because the biochar is the principal thing to fight global warming. There are two basic ways to make biochar, and you saw them in the previous slide: a retort or a Toplit updraft unit. And you have to make it at about 500. That's where the biochar has the best cation exchange capacity, 500 degrees centigrade. That's kind of hot. And whatever the size of the tea-liter retort, the feedstock has to be dry. And we could talk about that if you guys are interested. And you have to be able to control the oxygen so that you get biochar and not ash. And you want to tune it to avoid the carbon monoxide and the particulate matter. There is also another way to make biochar, and somehow I missed putting this in the slide. You see this? It's a giant cone that's about as wide as my arm spread, about this high. It's called a Kontiki kiln. Paul Taylor created that, and it was published about 1.5 years ago. The problem is the Kontiki is going to cost you $2,000. That doesn't fit into the democratization of biochar, where the do-it-yourselfers and everybody can make a good quality product. But if you want biochar, you've got two options. You can buy it with transportation cost, and it is always transportation cost that are the #1 factor when you start shipping natural resources around. Wholesale by the cubic yard, look at those figures, $250 to $680 right now for a cubic yard. That's 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. That's obscene. These other people, they're charging for a quality product, but it is still expensive. All of them are advertised as biochar, but you have to charge the biochar with some sort of plant nutrient. So the actual biochar is only down about 30 or 40%. Well, 20% in some cases, and the rest of it is compost of some form. You're paying $4 a pound when I can buy a cubic yard of wood chips, make it in my backyard at a cost of 64 cents a pound. That is the democratization of biochar. Make it yourself and make it cheap, because it's just as good as anything. And what I recommend for you people here on the island of Vashon, organize a group of folks, borrow a trailer, build some T-LEDs in a big T-LED building workshop, start accumulating waste, yard waste, any kind of woody waste, and work with whoever's got a big chipper and make a big bunch of biochar and share it in the fall. It just works like a charm. It's obviously also organic. Whoops. Now, if we're gardening without biochar, ammonium nitrate is the most common fertilizer in the world, because nitrogen is the most volatile and labile plant nutrient in the world, used in an enormous number of formulations. You can lose 40% putting it into your soil. It washes away in the water, it evaporates into the air, and 40% of the money you spent for it is simply gone. Nowadays, people want to do an organic garden and avoid the chemical fertilizers. Even if you use a good organic fertilizer and you work up your garden and we get one of these 5-day rains coming in the Pacific Northwest, you can lose 80% of your nitrogen just washing away. You can lose 172% of your calcium and 136% of the magnesium. All that was, I shouldn't say all, most of what was in there, plus what you put in there to bring that garden up to a real nutritional level. The secret of biochar is that it has a negative charge and it acts like an anion, so it gloms on to the positive charges for almost all of the plant nutrient elements, all of the elements necessary for plant nutrients. The nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and others. And one thing we can't quite figure out, it also grabs onto the anions under certain circumstances, and people are trying to figure that one out. Here we go. Here are the caveats for doing it. If you make biochar and put it in the soil and you just make it and put it in, you know, Americans are classic for wanting instant results. So you make biochar and you stick it in the soil. It will depress the living bejesus out of your plants because the first thing it's going to do is absorb all of those nutrients and tie them up. And I've seen this firsthand. You need to mix it with some sort of plant nutrient. And compost, urine, feces, worm castings, compost tea, organic fertilizer, even some of the chemical fertilizers can be used to charge or load. If you mix it with compost, that figure is actually wrong, 1 to 9. Now it's coming down to 1 to 4 parts, 1 part biochar, 4 parts compost. If you mix it with urine, pee on it, and when it's loaded, put it in the garden. I'll show you an example of that later. Whoops.
You mix it with urine, it's 1 to what?
1 to 1.
1 to 1.
1 to 1. If you've got 5 gallons of,
Make a great quenching liquid.
I'm sorry?
Make a great quenching liquid if you can stand the smell. To quench your charcoal.
Actually, there is no smell. I've got one on my deck and I've got one outside my workshop. Hardware screen about this big around, about this tall. Straight biochar goes in and I use it and it will last me a good 3 months with very little smell. And when it starts to smell, sort of like the men's room in a bar, then you put it into the garden. What happened to the PowerPoint? We're working on it. Okay, are there other questions? Guys, feel free to ask anything, because if I can't answer it, Ken can, or Francesco.
We'd like to point out that activated charcoal is used all around the world for odor control.
I have a question where Zero Waste is starting to experiment with bokashi. And so home waste, can you put biochar in the mix of bokashi and get nutrient storage in the charcoal from that as a storage tank? Would that provide nutrients?
Yes, it will. We are going to talk about, we will talk about plant nutrition a little bit later and actually go earlier than that and bring you up to speed on the science. Boy, I hope I didn't do that.
No.
Another question?
There we go. Back.
You're back. Can you talk about the level of carbon sequestration and what we could expect on Vashon? How could we work out the numbers of that?
I'm sorry, the level of?
Carbon sequestration.
Sequestering carbon on Vashon.
We will talk about that. We will talk about that. The problem is that kind of research is right at cutting edge right now, and they're still kind of working that part of it out for carbon sequestration. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Another question? Yes, sir. There's always a little bit of ash in the biochar. You can't avoid it. And you put, if your soil is 6.5, you add the biochar and it'll jump to 6.8 or 6.9, but over the next 2 years, it'll come back down to 6.5. It's a short-term liming agent. Good question. Important point, you have to charge that biochar before you put it in your garden soil. It's the biochar that creates the healthy soil, that creates the microbiological community that makes the soil healthy, that will produce the vegetables that you want to see produced out of your garden. Try this once more. You would not believe how many pictures I've seen like this. Biochar and NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, just straight fertilizer. This is unamended, poor soil, basically subsoil. This picture was taken at Iowa State from Biochar farms. And look at the difference in how the corn responds. This is a picture in Brazil. Same young man, side by side side by side soil and crop differences. That's pretty remarkable. How much biochar should you add? 2 years ago, it was a wide open question. Some people said 1/4 inch, other people said 5-6 inches. This slide is in your handout. And I think Gib has either passed them out or will pass them out. It's coming down to about 5 to 10% of your soil should be biochar. But the biochar has different functions in different soils. In Will's soil, which is very sandy, the biochar helps hold the water. But in Ken's soil, which is real clay, it lightens the soil and improves the tilth. But they both, in both gardens, still hold the nutrients. These are the recommended levels. But keep in mind, most gardeners think about soil that's 10 to 12 inches deep, but the Amerindians were creating soils that were 3 to 6 foot deep, apparently for obvious reasons, because it helped their productivity. But some crops go down 18 feet. This is a picture my wife took at the National Botanic Garden of all these different crops, and look at the root depth. 6 to 8 feet is pretty common. And why did they go that deep? They're pulling up nutrients that's not in the topsoil.
Can you top dress or do you have to mix it in?
I'm sorry?
Can you top dress with it or do you have to mix it?
We're going to talk about that. Come on. Here we go. This is a brand new slide. If you want to create a biochar permaculture garden, there's 4 kind of intermixed interdisciplines to do it. First I recommend if you have an existing garden and your place is pretty well developed, simply put in 1/4 inch per year and work it in like you normally would do for your gardening. But if you've got a new garden and you really want to jumpstart it, brand new garden, add 10%. That's kind of a lot of biochar, about that deep, over the whole thing. Add sand if you've got clay, because it'll improve the tilth. Dig it all in. Add a truckload of compost and let it sit. The biochar will charge in the soil over that next year, and it will jumpstart that microbiological community that makes soils so productive. You also have a yearly schedule. Start accumulating your landscape waste. Maybe if you want to jumpstart it, make your own, buy some wood chips. In Squim, I can buy a cubic yard, when they actually deliver about 1.5 yards for $32. That's a lot of wood chips. And I can then make about 80 gallons of biochar. In the summer, you guys need to hold a big workshop and make some big tea lots, like we're going to show you this afternoon over at the Seattle Distillery. In the fall, you do the pyrolysis and make the biochar after the burn ban goes off. Make biochar all winter in your wood stove. Use it in a urinal outside. and a monthly schedule, garden like you normally would, but cook your meals over a small tea lud. That's why Ken is bringing his 1 gallon. Francesco and I went to a tea lud workshop in Seattle with Art Donnelly, and a young woman at the farmer's market came over with a big fry pan, and she was cooking fry bread on the tea luds we had just built. That was really cool. These are the documented benefits of biochar in soil. Cation exchange capacity of 50% increase. The highest CEC I have ever seen in soils was in a biochar amended soil. And what does that mean? It simply means that's a measure of how the soil can hold and deliver nutrients to your plants. That's all it is. With biochar, it's like having a really good financial nest egg that you can put some money into and pull some money out as you need. Without biochar, it's like living paycheck to paycheck. Just makes it a little bit tough. The second point, biochar takes up humates and prevents them from leaching away during excess precipitation events. This is brand new stuff. People are looking at biochar absorbing the humates because it's the humates with the microbiological community that really makes the soil productive. It's a liming agent, a slight pH increase, which then goes back. Sandy soils, you get an 18% crop productivity. Be careful with what you read here. If you and I amend a really bad soil with biochar and an organic fertilizer, you'll get astounding productivity compared to what was there before. And that accounts for this 120 and 200 and 300% increase in productivity. If you've got a really healthy soil and you start using biochar, you'll get about a 20% increase. You also get some increases in quality and culinary usefulness. Methane emissions, 100% decrease. That really surprised me. Any of you that are climate activists know the role of methane, and the climate scientists are really worried about methane clathrates in the Arctic. If the global temperature goes up and these things start bubbling to the surface, we could hit a tipping point that we cannot recover from for global warming. That scares the hell out of me. Nitrous oxide emissions, that one really surprised me. A 50% decrease in general, but on some soils there was no effect. Nitrous oxide is so important because it's almost 300 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Reduced bulk density, well, that's just nice. It makes the soils lighter. Mycorrhizal fungi, 40% increase. Will, you and I were talking about fungi this morning. That's exactly the kind of thing I want to see. Biological nitrogen fixation. How many people grow beans? They fix nitrogen from the air with rhizobia bacteria. The biochar helps them do that. Last year, my scarlet runner beans, they're normally about this high, 2 plants will get about this big. I had them go 8 foot and spread 10 foot in the bird netting above. It was just astounding. And great, big, delicious beans. I just love it. Pesticide remediation. When biochar was added to pesticide-polluted soil, the pesticides started decreasing. We think it's that microbiological community of all the bacteria and protists and worms and all that stuff that is actually detoxifying the pesticides. In fact, there are areas now where people have amended their soils with biochar, and to get a pesticide to work, they have to apply more, and we're telling them not to do that. Find an organic way to do it. Heavy metal remediation. A friend of mine lives the other side of Port Angeles, and he's been making biochar for years. He was hired on a contract basis to put biochar in a mine site that hadn't seen a sprig of vegetation for 18 years. They got in there with the biochar, they tilled it up, it adsorbed the heavy metals, and now it's green as anything you would imagine. The heavy metals are still there, but they're tied to the biochar. And in heavily leached or weathered soils, like we have here, It reduces the leaching of your nitrogen and the calcium and magnesium. Come on. So what's the real answer? It's beginning to look like you cannot add too much biochar as long as you recognize it's an ecological system that you need to maintain. Add compost, use organic fertilizer, kitchen compost, leaves, whatever kind of compost you got, and whatever mechanism you're using to add that, just mimic Mother Nature. Peggy and I have not had a compost pile except to hold commercial compost to mix with plants we are about to put into the ground, new plants. We want a little extra compost. I sheet compost everything. That means if this is my garden, everything out of our kitchen, everything out of the crops, out of the yard, just goes right in on top of the soil, just like Mother Nature does. Why make it complicated with these 4, 5, 6 bin composting systems or adding a lot of technology to it? I really don't think you need to. Second, treat that garden like it was your teenage son trying to eat you out of house and home. Remember what that's like? The guy was, he could just devour volumes of food. Think of that garden as your family member, feeding it compost, feeding it biochar, feeding it tender loving care, with the weeding and normal gardening you do. You will find, let's suppose we went out this afternoon, let me get this one point and I'll come back to you. If we went out this afternoon and we built a biochar garden in your garden, we added the biochar and we planted. The first year you'll look at it and you'll think, well, that looks pretty good, about like it did last year. The second year, you'll stand back and you'll look at it and you'll think, wow, this is beginning to really show itself. I'm beginning to feel like I'm making progress. The third year, you will think, holy buckets, I am a gardener. Stuff will get so productive. The fourth year, you will start revising your garden schedule. You'll put your rows further apart. You'll put the plants a little further apart because last year, my garden was out of control. I couldn't even walk between the rows. Stuff just went bananas, but it takes 4 or 5 years for those effects to build up. And why does it take 4 or 5 years? Will knows the answer. Microbiological community, everything. You'll dig in that soil and you'll see worms and protozoans and bacteria and fungi. You will see fungi invading those biochar particles, just living on the nutrients that are adsorbed to the surface and all the bacteria around it. And third, a talented gardener, and I've seen some gardens here in the Pacific Northwest where they add biochar. What's the big deal? A talented gardener can max out the production, they add biochar, and they say, well, this isn't such a hot topic, until they look at their fertilizer bill and it's 40 to 50% less. Those nutrients are adsorbed to the biochar and they're held through the season. You're not going chemical feeding, boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. You're feeding through the season. What Peggy and I have noticed, we think, we need to document this, we think our period of culinary harvest is a little bit longer. You know how beets, kohlrabi, and turnips get kind of woody at the end of the season, and the kids start flinging them at each other, see if they can hit each other in the head? They don't get as woody. I had a turnip I'll show you later. I had a turnip like this that was still almost, I'm sorry, you asked a question.
I had a question about pH and being able to monitor your pH as you go through, and you talk about it being like 6 months from when you first put your biochar in to when you really want to be planting on it. Maybe I heard that wrong.
She's asking a question about monitoring the pH. Honest to gosh, I do not. The soil self-regulates the pH in your area. And my soil is 6.5 with biochar, is 6.5 without the biochar. But if I try to grow blueberries, which require a pH of 4.5, I have a hell of a time getting that pH down. I'm using elemental sulfur and trying to get that pH just right. And this year, I'm finally getting a few blueberries. But honest to gosh, I don't worry about it because that microbiological community seems to be self-regulating. And that's the cool part. Crop production is dependent on a particular crop. Like some things just don't respond, and other things like tomatoes and potatoes, they think it's gangbusters. Let's just really get into this. This is the shot off my deck. That's a chicken coop. This is 2,000 square foot organic garden, and this is a 2,000 square foot organic garden, okay? This side gets biochar, this side does not. And why did I do that? One of the hallmarks of developed societies is they break natural, elemental, and nutrient loops that God and Mother Nature created. The manure, the plants, everything hit the ground. It feeds the next generation of everything coming along. With my chickens, that's where the poop is coming from. The compost is coming from Peggy's kitchen and whatever we do in the yard, and I'm gardening like a typical organic gardener over here. In the fall, they switch sides. The chickens come over here, and because chickens believe in a scorched earth policy, anybody who's ever grown chickens knows this, they eat everything, they clean it up. That soil is fallow for 1 year, so they do about 60% of the weeding for me. I garden here the next year. Is it working? That is Bodega, an heirloom potato. That is an Ozette, and that's a German butterball. That's a full-size Fiesta-ware plate. That is a Yukon Gold potato. And of course, that's my wife, and look at those carrots. You talk about juicy, flavorful carrots. They're just outstanding, just outstanding. One of my favorite things to do is pull out my pocket knife, pick something in the garden, go to the hose, wash the dirt off, and start munching. That's a 12-inch ruler. That's a daikon. Now that was a daikon. Another Yukon Gold potato. And notice this turnip. I wish I had a better picture. It's about the size of one of my hens out there. Just for hoots and giggles, I pulled out the pocket knife and sliced off a piece. And it wasn't the best, but it was still edible. Non-biochar, biochar. And what we've noticed on the chickens, there is less shell breakage in the coop. And we're now adding biochar to the coop, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Last year, instead of alternating chickens and garden back and forth, I decided to set up a little test garden in both sides and record everything that happened. Well, I got too busy, but I did manage to take some pictures. This is German whoops. If I learn to operate this, I'll be in good shape. This is German butterball potatoes from the biochar side, and this is the non-biochar side. Almost every potato we harvested, unless it was, rotting or something. What do you notice? Just shout it out. The size, and what do you notice about the ones on the right? A little bit of potato scab. Organic gardeners will tell you if your plants are healthy, they're going to be able to resist pests and diseases a little better. Guys, I haven't seen a vegetable-specific pest do any damage in our garden for 3 years on the biochar side, but I do see other problems on the non-biochar side. Slugs, of course, they'll get in there and they'll eat anything they can get to, but they're not a specific pest. I thought that was really dramatic. I took that to Squim Organic Gardeners, and boy, did I make brownie points that day. This is research out of Virginia Tech. Look at what's happening with biochar biochar garden with control to a non-biochar garden. And look at this, 520% increase in the mycorrhizal fungi. That's what you want to create. That soil that is so rich, it's incredible. As long as I'm thinking about it, let me tell you about it now. It is becoming very, very clear. There are microbes that live on fresh, green, dead stuff, microbes that live on brown, rotting stuff, and microbes that live on black stuff, meaning biochar. You want all three in a constantly rotating, feeding that garden kind of discipline because it works. Another result out of Virginia Tech, look at that, 22% increase in tomatoes in one plot, 47% increase in another plot. 2 cups of inoculated biochar in 100 cups of potting soil that was in a greenhouse. And that big, thick tome I told you about earlier, people are starting to really get in and analyze stuff. This is a meta-analysis. That crop production increase from 20 to up to 400, I've seen as high as, 300%. If every one of us is a gardener, we all know there are things we're going to have in common, but we also know there are differences. Well, if you apply the meta-analysis, we can discount the differences and find out what we have in common. And on good soils, look where that mean is for soil and crop improvement, right about 22%. And look how some things respond. Like this is a Japanese leafy green. The forage greens, radishes. You should taste my radishes. A neighbor came over and I was doing the pocket knife, wash it in the garden hose and eat it. And I handed one to Mary and she ate it and she says, "This is the best friggin' radish I ever had." Of course, some things don't respond. Look at ryegrass, thought it was terrible, didn't want to touch it at all. Beets, I have noticed our beets don't seem to get woody like they usually do. Maybe, something is going on there. I don't know what. Let me give you another metric. One year, we planted a 25-foot row of potatoes over here, and Peggy and I harvested 164 pounds, I think it was, in these big plastic flats like this. And we thought, wow, that's really good. We've got a bunch of older single people in our neighborhood, so we gave them all a box of potatoes, and we had more than enough to eat. The next year, a 25-foot row over here, we harvested 300 pounds. 14 neighbors got a box of potatoes, and the food shelf got a big shipment. It's not apples to apples comparison, it's apples to oranges comparison, but it still is really clear. Over here, I planted 3 Komboka squash, the wonderful squash, 3 plants. We got 18 squash, nice squash, really pleased. On this side, we got 53 squash before the plants frosted out. Just amazing. Come on. Come on. There we go. Everybody who's a gardener has seen this book. Steve Solomon is like the guru in this part of the world, and he's truly excellent because he's got to experience it himself and test it before he starts telling the world about how to garden. Come on, here we go. I recommend everybody get a professional soil test. And I'm not talking $17.95 gizmo at the farm store. I'm talking the $50 variety that really tells you what's in your soils. This is the biochar side. I honestly was expecting my nitrogen to be much higher because it's adsorbed onto the biochar, but it's not. That tells me I've got to add more. But it tells you exactly what's needed. And for good plant growth, the paradigm has always been, well, get these levels up into the mid-range and you'll have a good garden. And that's true. And they give you this really good report, it usually comes with it, tells you how to improve your soils. The next step after that is this. This is mineral balancing. Steve Solomon has been a pioneer on this part. He's been working with this Erica Reinheimer for general mineralization recommendations. And if we go back, see all this row of numbers? You plug those into this website, okay? And I don't care what kind of plant nutrition you're practicing. It can be the finest compost system you've ever seen, or anaerobic digestion, or bokashi, or praying to the moon, or burying fish heads. What you want is plant nutrition that hits that sweet spot right here. Why is that important? It's because the various elements interact with each other. Like if you get too much phosphorus, it will interfere with your calcium uptake and vice versa. And you see what the interactions are there. What you want is that sweet spot right there in the middle. You plug your numbers into growabundant.com, and it's a subscription website, $9 a year. The Fruit Club, Vega, all of you should subscribe to that, because you can submit your soil test and it will tell you exactly what is needed for your garden soil, with your compost levels, with your style of gardening. I just love it. I substitute feather meal for soybean meal. It's a lot cheaper. I spend about $35 to $75 a year to fertilize our gardens and the landscape. Half of this I had to buy on the internet. And what's really important about this, the philosophy is if the minerals are not in your soil, they're not going to be in your plants, and they're not going to be in your body, and you will suffer. You might not feel it, but there are a host of human diseases and plant diseases that are associated with the lack of elemental nutrition. Like if you don't have enough calcium in your soil, what happens to your tomatoes? Bingo, bingo. I haven't seen disease in our plants on the biochar side for 3 years running now, even with the goofy weather we have. That is just remarkable. Now let's switch gears a little bit. One of the broken nutrient elements is sewer systems. All that manure, all that plant nutrition in urine is just going into the ground. It gets composted, it gets sucked out, it goes to the sewage treatment plant. That is terrible. That is a waste. On a personal level towards sustainability, I really recommend this. It's as simple as you see. 1/2-inch hardware screen cloth, 2 feet tall. I cut off a pot at the top for a splash shield, and I go out there and I pee in it. One on my deck, one outside my workshop. It takes me about 3 to 4 months to load that biochar with the nutrients. And I know when it's full, because my wife will tell me, Norm, you got to get that off the deck. Good grief. And it happens over about a 4-day period. It suddenly turns stinky. I took one of those and I put it as mulch around this hybrid buckeye tree in our yard. I put it around the currants. I put it around the grape vines. I put it around the kiwi. And I covered it up with mulch, a good composty wood mulch. And see what would happen. The grass went like this. It hit the edge of that mulch and it went up like this, and then here's the mulch in the plant. Last year, my peaches, my kiwi, and the grapes all produced fruit for the first time. The currants produced fruit the first year. We just put in some apple trees, and we had an apple the very first year, just one, but still, that's pretty good for a new transplant. It just jump-starts that healthy soil into productivity. And look at this citation down here. The fellows took biochar, filled it with cow urine, put it into the field, and they got a 300% increase compared to an 85% increase with biochar only. That's remarkable. Yes, ma'am.
Tell me a little bit about the timing on then putting the biochar, the loaded biochar down, and then when you talked before about kind of giving it time in the soil.
Yes.
just throwing the plants at it.
Yep.
So you already have existing grapes, for instance, and I would keep it away from the blueberries that are there, maybe, but how long would you expect to be putting it in before, like, say, fruiting season?
Work it in to your normal gardening schedule. If it's time to go out and maybe fertilize the fruit trees and freshen the mulch, just add the biochar and loaded biochar and make it work. In our vegetable garden, you can put it in any time you're out there gardening. What you want to do is have that current schedule and then that yearly schedule making it, and that really helps. Yes, ma'am?
Can you load the charcoal with stuff from your septic tank?
The question is, can you load biochar with stuff from the septic tank? I think you can, but I've never heard of anybody trying it. I don't know why it wouldn't work.
Make pumping a lot easier.
It sure I will tell you, I had a composting toilet for a while, and instead of wood shavings, I put chunk biochar, and I created the biggest mess you ever saw in my basement. The third time I created that mess, that composting unit went out. But what I'm trying to talk my wife into, I want to convert our toilet upstairs into a urine separating toilet, which are now becoming available in this country. So the poop goes to a composting toilet, the pee goes down a thin tube to a 55-gallon drum in the basement, and once a year, I drop in a little pump and pump the urine out into biochar or pump it out onto the lawn and fertilize the grass. That happened this past year at a Swedish condominium complex that's trying to be an eco-village. They put urine separating toilets in all of the condos. It all went to a collection site in the basement. They hooked it to a pump, and they had this little applicator that was going up and down fertilizing the lawn. And everybody said, oh my God, that's going to stink, it's going to be terrible. I go, please don't do that. 2 hours later, you couldn't smell a thing, you couldn't see anything, but they got good growth on the lawn. As a first step for sustainability, especially on a living unit that size, that was definitely a good idea. Francesco. I'm sorry. Yep. Speak up so everybody can hear. I can't even hear. You can't hear. I know. Guys, the evolution to true sustainability happens on two fronts. Personal sustainability, like a biochar urinal or biochar in the basement, and at the bigger scale in our general economy, and that is a little bit hard. But on a personal level, it can be the simplest thing. Like this, made biochar one afternoon, constructed that in the workshop, and I had good collection agents for 4 months. Now, I'll admit my wife doesn't want to use it. You know, this is sexist, but it can be done, and it's easy. It's surprisingly easy. And I want you to notice this. There is enough nitrogen in human urine to fertilize all of the corn crops in North America. That one surprised me. We don't need ammonium nitrate and Dr. Earth and other stuff for a nitrogen source for our gardens. You just have to know what you're doing. Oh boy, come on. This is the kind of paradigm that's showing up. Biochar is at the center of it, and it operates like gears. We've just talked about soils improvements, and I've told you pretty close to state of the art for what's happening in the soils and garden improvements. Let's look at these other two things. And I want to point out, biochar is the low-hanging fruit for getting to sustainability, along with energy efficiency. Peg and I live in a house that costs me $150 a year to heat. We spend a lot of electricity on other things, but $150 a year is I'm really pleased with that. We have a hydronic radiant floor system where we heat with electric heat, but we heat the house with a wood stove, 1 1/3 cords of wood for the entire winter. My neighbor next door is using 7 cords. We are suspecting biochar will replace some of the greatest uses for fuel, heating, and transportation. And now we're finally figuring out, there's been 2 papers. Biochar has been shown to be the only effective technological tool for fighting global warming. Put that biochar in the ground. Climate situation. The use of biomass for energy provides significant environmental advantages. Part of that win-win-win. To meet the goals of the Kyoto Agreement, we have to reduce our emissions to a 7% below the 1990 levels. If we had a biochar program, we would be Kyoto compliant. The problem is there is no stable, credible plan to staving off global warming. We might hit a tipping point, and then, folks, we are screwed, especially if those cloth rates or that mid-Atlantic circulation pattern breaks down. Those are the 2 tipping points that scare the bejesus out of the climate scientists. If you want to read one of the most interesting, insightful examinations of the Paris talks, read this. It's written by Albert Bates. It's acerbic, it's actual. He's a permaculture person. He did one of the books earlier on biochar. This is outstanding. I can read a page and sit here and think about it for 20 minutes before I go on to the next page. The Paris Agreement by Albert Bates is just exceptional. It's a real easy read, and he's got a real style with the language that I just love. There is no carbon capture and storage project that has been shown to really be successful. At least as of this one author. This is the ecological situation we've always thought of. You know, CO2 in the atmosphere, the plants take it up, they deposit some in the soil, and you get this big circular thing like this. We can amend that a little bit and sequester 20% of the carbon in waste wood annually, 20% of our emissions. And if you start adding natural fires to it, which also produces biochar, we are beginning to recognize that biochar is a normal ecological function for a normally functioning ecosystem, and the plants have had millennia to adapt to it. And now we have the opportunity to take it just a step further and start restoring depleted soils, restoring our agricultural soils. Does it work? I think I skipped a slide here. What the hell? If you do a life cycle analysis where avoided emissions like nitrous oxide and methane, you take that into account, each crop has different greenhouse emissions, but notice the cumulative avoided emissions of using biochar in the soils are always significantly better than simply burning the biomass for energy. Whoops, luckily, here we go. And if you compare published estimates of how much bioenergy is available, we are flush with biomass to make it work. And these estimates, which came out of that big tome on biochar environmental management, are all based on sustainability standards. Very important. This is what we think of when woody waste. The truth is, there is more urban and suburban woody waste than in all the forest in North America. Urban and suburban woody waste. We've been letting it rot or compost or chip it up or ship it off or do something terrible with it when it is really a very valuable resource when you know how to handle it. This was really cool. Francesco brought this up at one of the workshops we did. Sir Richard Branson offered $25 million for someone who could come up with a way to fight global warming that was market-based. If you're a climate advocate, everybody says, well, God, all you environmental people are shooting in the dark and you're proposing these outlandish schemes. It's got to be a market-based carbon sequestration scheme. He put this together in 2007. The prize has not been awarded. They had 10,000 submissions, narrowed it down to just a couple of thousand, and then had these finalists in red, the top 11. 4 of those finalists involved biochar, and 2 more involved biochar indirectly. That is really clear to me. I suspect they're going to have to just jumpstart and award the prize to somebody to jumpstart the biochar revolution in our economy. And you notice who is here on this panel of judges? That is world-class climate talent. Oh, come on. Business as usual. This is where I'm going to get real nerdy on you. Each one of us has a carbon footprint, and we require almost 20 acres. We have a deficit per person of 10 acres of natural resources in this nation, which is just outstanding. The carbon footprint, each one of us generates 20 tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalents per year. A CO2 equivalent is nitrous oxide and, methane. We've got to get this under control, people. The environmental people are getting on board. If you want to read a really good assessment of the environmental impacts of all of the biochar, go to the Natural Resources Defense Council. That's an excellent position paper. Other important position papers: Northwest Biocarbon Initiative, Pacific Northwest U.S. Biochar Initiative. There is a meeting coming up in Corvallis, Oregon, United States Biochar Initiative. It's going to be 5 days long. Ken and I, and probably Francesco, are probably going to go. 5 days of nothing but biochar, economic production, agriculture, soil improvement, avoided emissions, everything you can think of. And I am really looking forward to this. This is going to be a cast of characters that's going to make my day. The International Biochar Initiative, they are a clearinghouse for everything to do with biochar, and they are overloaded, but they are really making a lot of progress, keeping everybody on the same page and organized for information. Again, it's the biochar that runs this win-win-win situation. Let's look at the renewable energy, and I want you to notice here, again, biochar is the only effective technological tool for fighting global warming. There are 2 recent studies. Teams of PhDs looked at different aspects of how to put carbon in the ground, and there were some really silly schemes. Biochar was the only one that was democratized, effective, and worked for the long term. With a half-life of 1,100 years, it's there to stay. Maybe we'll even have time to get our lifestyle sustainable. Come on, come on, come on. This thing just doesn't want to cooperate. I'm going to ask somebody to go up, maybe in that top row, and operate this. Push this button here to go forward, this button to back.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Wow, okay. Gib tells me I got 5 minutes. As usual, I'm talking way too long. Shoot it right over the desk. Next one. Here we go. Let me show you something you've probably never seen before. What does this look like? This is a piece of red alder off my property. This is what I put in my wood stove. If we analyze this and take it apart down to its essentials, about 30% is biochar, can be made into biochar, and 60%, right there, is what we call synthetic oil or syn oil or bio oil. And the last 15% is called syn gas or biogas, okay? 30, about 60, about 15. Every piece of wood you can do that with. They have different uses. Next slide. I'm running out of time, so I got to go a little bit further. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Ken. The state is finally getting on the on the bandwagon to really do this. This was a pyrolysis demonstration down in Bingen, Washington. My wife and I went down. This was a 1 ton per hour wood chip going in one end and biochar and syn oil coming out the other end. There was a 50% energy positive return that could be used in diesel with a little chemistry. This is the way to do it. And it only had CO2 and water as emissions. And I made a point when the state health department was there to measure the emissions, I was right next to him. And he's looking at this technology and he's looking at the screen and he turned to everybody and he went, "You have no problem at all for emissions." That's exactly what you want to hear. Next slide. Environmental consequences. Notice, well, I'm going to let you read that real quickly. But the point is we can sequester 12% of our annual atmospheric emissions of CO2 right now with biochar. Sustainable harvest could replace 25% of our U.S. oil consumption. Avoided emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, are 2 to 5 times greater when you pyrolyze and make biochar than they are when you apply the energy used for agricultural land. And at the national level, we could be Kyoto compliant. All we have to do is jumpstart that nitrogen program. Next slide. This is Wayne Keith. I love this story. Wayne Keith is a big raw bone farmer in Arkansas. He has been running his vehicles on wood gas. Some of us old farts remember wood gas from World War II, where you took wood like this and you pyrolyze it and you get this gas and you run it to your engine. Next slide. Wayne started working on this some time ago. He made a wood chipper out of a truck rear end. I love it. He's got these chunks. The next slide. This is his pickup truck, his pyrolysis unit, a condenser and a filter, and it goes straight to his gas carburetor. Okay, next slide. This is a little better photo of it. He has to use a little bit of gas to get the engine going, but once it's going, he switches to wood gas. Next slide. And this is how he's doing. This just amazes me. He has no negative consequences for his machinery. He gets 5,000 miles out of a cord of wood. That just tickles me no end. 16 pounds gives him a gallon of gas. His truck gets 29 mpg. He's carbon negative. He creates biochar. His transportation is carbon negative. He's energy independent. He's sequestering carbon. His tailpipe emissions exceed the most stringent in the nation. He's been awarded a green award by the EPA. He now has a book and a website and a blog. I wish I had the technology to drive my vehicle on wood gas. He's got 250,000 miles on 6 different trucks, and he is still going. He only uses 9 gallons of gas per year. Next slide. Whoop, back up one. A couple of years ago, back up one. A couple of years ago, the state of Washington, with Washington State University, came out with this Beyond Waste objectives, and they began to see the potential for what biochar, syn oil, and syngas could do for our economy and culture. And they pointed out 14 tons of slash per acre cost logging companies $2,000. You get smoke, ash, and sterilized soil. You can read these other things. We can burn it, let it rot, or compost it. Next slide. More and more companies are trying to go to zero waste, and I have to compliment you zero waste people. You are at cutting edge, and you're going to face an uphill battle to get to true zero waste. And I recommend right now you concentrate on biochar and forestry waste, urban waste here on the island to get that. And once that starts demonstrating itself, it will blossom into these other areas. A lot of cities are going to single stream recycling. I would bet 50% of us recycle the bottles and the cans and the paper and the cardboard and all that good stuff. 250 cities have now gone to single stream. Everything goes into the garbage can. And there's a whole series of ways to separate out all of the stuff that's in that municipal waste. They are achieving 80% recycling when the national average is down at 20%. Next slide. And it's everything you can imagine. This is my transfer station in Port Angeles after all of the recycling that everybody in our area does. Next slide. Publications, these are online. There's 4 publications just like this, trying to get to that zero waste. You know, they're promoting and hoping people will figure it out. Next slide. Look at what can be pyrolyzed and made into charcoal. That's our waste stream. And that's the amount of recycling. Here's recycling, you know, the little thin budgets. But look how much can be recycled and made into syn oil and syngas. And remember this, when we get to zero waste, we are going to have a 90% volume reduction with a 50% positive energy return. 15% of the energy there is going to be required to run the facility. What's the problem with this scenario? Contaminants, especially heavy metals. But look how much energy could be captured. This would make charcoal. This would not make biochar. This would make charcoal which could be sequestered at a 90% volume reduction. That's what a landfill should do. Next slide. They're also considering pyrolyzing sewage waste, sewage sludge. This is a list from one of the activist websites of all of the contaminants that end sewage, and it varies. Every single sewage plant has a different list of nasty stuff in it. But if we dried it, again, 90% volume reduction, 50% energy return, and everything from here down is destroyed. I have the feeling this is going to be one of the principal mechanisms to reduce pollutants and remove pollutants from our economy, our mainstream, our homes, you know, foods, everything. Because so much simply goes out the stack as carbon dioxide and water. We will need halogen scrubbers for chlorine and bromine and stuff like that, but that's cheap and easy technology. The only things that are regulated are those things in red. All the rest of it is unregulated. That is a crime against the American people. Do not ever put sewage sludge, unless it's tested for heavy metals, on your soil. I have a friend down by Long Beach, and his neighbor put sewage sludge like this because they paid him to take it. He put it all over his agricultural land. They said it was composted with landscape waste. They said it was going to grow crops like you can't believe. His soil test showed that if they did that 4 or 5 times, they would create a Superfund site for heavy metals. Do not put sewage sludge on your garden soils. Next slide. Again, biochar and energy efficiency is the low-hanging fruit. We have to evaluate each project case by case to know what the pollutants are, what the feedstocks are, get real data, and then we can move forward. And right now, the energy proposals, more and more fossil fuel plants are going to biomass. The temperature becomes lower, and because they go to complete combustion, they are polluting the bejesus out of the atmosphere. Francesco has been working with the paper plant there in Port Townsend, and they are now making a quality biochar. Their emissions have improved. You should have him up and have him give you a lecture on that sometime. The next slide. This is the new paradigm, not just biochar with climate, energy, and soils, waste management. That is cutting edge. You zero waste people, you are cutting edge without the information. And I can tell there's a bunch of professionals in this audience, people who really know what they're doing. And let me use Gibb as an example. He's an accomplished architect, and I know he has books, websites, newsletters, probably a blog or two that he uses for his architecture. Go to scholar.google.com. It's a typical search engine, but it's only dedicated to peer-reviewed scientific publications. And just see what you find for your profession. I would bet that if Gibb starts looking for biochar on Google Scholar, plus what he finds in his normal sources of information, he will find ways to advance sustainability in his personal and professional life. Remember that, scholar.google.com. That is so effective, you cannot believe it. And it's designed for somebody to write and read. You get abstracts. You'll run into some scientific jargon, but that's okay. You'll get through the jargon. Next slide. Conclusion. Biochar is going to do all of these things. It's just incredibly clear. That T-lead that I'm going to show you this afternoon and Ken's going to show you, that is the cleanest burn on the face of the earth. That really excites me. I mean, that really excites me. Next slide. And more uses are being found for biochar. And there are some really amusing stories. There was a lady that asked about growing blueberries. Well, if your soil is pH 6.5 and you try to grow blueberries, they're not going to grow. That pH has to be 4.5. One of the guys on the blog said, well, I'm going to try it with my blueberries. And everybody said, no. The pH will go basic and it'll destroy your blueberry crop. He did it anyway, but he added elemental sulfur to get the pH back down, and he got a 38% increase in his blueberries. Just remarkable. He knows what he's doing. Other things like animal feed, this was so cool a story I couldn't stand it. This farmer in Australia was making biochar and having a good time, with what it was doing with his crops, and he thought, I'll feed a little bit to my cows, and when they poop, they'll distribute it all over my... I'm sorry. He thought he would feed it to his cows, just a little bit, 1 or 2% in the cow feed. And these cows would distribute it.
That one right there.
Okay. All over his field. Sounds good. But his performance of his cows was so much better, he contacted a researcher at an Australian university, and this guy came out. I didn't touch it. I got it. This guy came out and applied some real science to it. His cows had an increased weight gain and an increased feed efficiency, and they didn't have any flatulence, which is methane, which is a greenhouse gas. Subsequent research has shown it works for pigs and cows, but not kangaroos. Don't you love it? Building insulation. A fellow used it in sheetrock and plaster, and the biochar was absorbing pollutants in the interior atmosphere. Who would have thought? It turns out biochar makes a really good insulator and upped the R value of his sheetrock. Who would have thought? And these other things, it just amazes me what is coming down the pike. It really is. And I think the last slide, yes, you can read this. People, are there any questions or speculations or comments? I'm open to anything. Francesco, Ken, Will, Gib, anything at all.
Can I ask, my worry is that forests are going to be start using to create biochar. Can you speak to that?
Every biochar expert that I have read has always adhered to sustainability guidelines, and the truth of the matter is the logging industry is required to maintain a certain level of ground cover to prevent erosion. And I don't like big clear-cut areas. I want to see 10% of the trees remain instead of the 2% they usually leave. But there's one kind of thing that's starting to happen. The Forest Service is looking at this, and what they envision is mobile pyrolyzers on truck beds. The slash gets picked up, ground up, goes right into a pyrolyzer. They harvest the energy in syn oil, and there are 2 companies now that have developed one-step catalyzed process to make it into diesel fuel. The biochar they're going to make is going to stay in the forest and get incorporated into the soil, improving destroyed soils from logging activities. It's kind of a win-win. It's starting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. That pyrolysis demonstration I showed you, that was practically built for the logging industry. There was another one this past year that was 10 ton per hour mobile pyrolysis unit for biochar and syn oil. And you get the container of syn oil, and it just looks like mineral oil. It's clear, and it's got a, it's just a light oil. And it was the syn gas that powered all that. Other questions?
Can I hold up? We're backed up. People are showing up to get the workshop demonstrations. So can we move everybody over to Seattle Distilling and we can have intimate workshop discussions? We'll have great time for questions then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.